In Mississippi, the sickest family scandal ever revealed was that he had children with his own grandmother. A phrase that alone causes chills and discomfort, it represents a dark reality from the isolated swamps of Humphreys County during the 1960s. Circulating in the small community of Belzoni, the first rumors about the Caldwell family began in the summer of 1962. Rarely appearing in public, the Caldwells lived isolated on a swampy property miles from the nearest town. When they did appear, they avoided all social interactions. The family matriarch was Margaret Caldwell, a 58-year-old woman at the time. Widowed for more than 2 decades, Margaret lived with her grandson, Elijah, 27, who had returned to the family property after his parents died in a car accident back in 1957. Surrounded by murky waters and dense vegetation, the property located in the depths of the swamps was an almost inaccessible location for visitors. Every time the family appeared in town to buy supplies, the residents of Belzoni noticed something strange. They always seemed nervous, looking over their shoulders as if they had something to hide. Years later, Martha Jenkins, owner of the town's only grocery store at that time, reported. The true horror of the situation began to unfold when Margaret gave birth to a child at the local hospital in October 1962. For a woman of almost 60, the event would already be extraordinary. But what shocked doctors and nurses was Margaret's absolute refusal to identify the child's father. She also would not explain how she had become pregnant at that age. Immediately, Dr. Howard Reynolds, the physician responsible for the delivery, noticed that something was wrong with the newborn. The child presented significant facial deformities, fused fingers, and an abnormally reduced cranial size. In his confidential report, which would only become public decades later, he documented his findings. Fearing the worst, local authorities initiated a discreet investigation. Sheriff James Wilson assigned young Deputy Robert Thompson to monitor the Caldwell property. "We received reports from neighbors about screams and strange behaviors," Wilson explained in an interview given years later. "We needed to verify the welfare of the children who supposedly lived there." What would shock even the most experienced investigators was the case that Thompson gradually built during his routine visits to the property. Margaret lived not only with her grandson Elijah, but also with 3 other children, all presenting deformities similar to the newborn. The older children barely spoke, Thompson reported in his personal diary discovered after his death in 1998. They had evident motor difficulties and facial features that indicated serious genetic problems. The truth only came to light when one of the children, approximately 5 years old, was hospitalized with severe pneumonia in January 1963. Upon examining the child, the medical team noticed signs of neglect and possible genetic problems consistent with cases of consanguinity. When questioned, Margaret finally broke her silence. She simply said that Elijah was the father of all the children, reported nurse Susan Parker, who was present during the confession. She said it without any emotion, as if she were commenting on the weather. To not miss exclusive revelations about the most disturbing family cases in American history that will never be shown in mainstream media, check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now. Your place in the community that uncovers society's darkest secrets is guaranteed. Shaking not only the small community of Belzoni but also the entire social services structure of the state of Mississippi was Margaret Caldwell's revelation. How could such a perverse relationship have remained hidden for so many years? And most importantly, how did the authorities allow for children to be born from this forbidden union? To fully understand the Caldwell case, we need to go back to 1957 when Elijah, then 22 years old, returned to the family property after his parents' death. According to local parish records, Elijah had left Belzoni years before to try life in Memphis, Tennessee, but never managed to establish himself due to social adaptation problems. Elijah was always a strange, withdrawn boy, commented Reverend Thomas Williams in his testimony to authorities. When he returned after his parents' death, he seemed even more isolated from the world. Margaret welcomed him as if he were a small child again, not an adult. Locally known as Devil's Swamp, the Caldwell property was practically inaccessible during the rainy seasons. The only dirt road leading to the house would be submerged for months, effectively isolating its residents from the outside world. This geographical condition was crucial in keeping the family secret for so long. Describing the Caldwell house as a museum of horrors frozen in time was social worker Jean Roberts, assigned to the case in 1963. According to her report, the residents had no electricity or running water. The walls were covered with old newspaper clippings and disturbing drawings made by the children. The most shocking thing was the naturalness with which everyone interacted, wrote Roberts. The children called Margaret Mommy and Elijah Daddy without any indication that they understood the abnormality of the situation. Revealing the devastating impact of consanguinity on their health were medical examinations performed on the 4 children: William, 8 years old, Sarah, 7 years old, James, 5 years old, and the newborn, Thomas. All presented microcephaly to varying degrees, congenital heart problems, and significant intellectual disability. The children's problems were consistent with the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes, typical of consanguineous relationships, explained Dr. Lawrence Peterson, a geneticist consulted by the authorities. In his report, he explained, when genetically very close individuals have children, the probability of congenital defects increases dramatically. But when authorities discovered diaries kept by Margaret since Elijah's return, the most disturbing aspect of the case came to light. The writings revealed a mind distorted by years of isolation and possibly untreated mental illness. Margaret described how she reconquered her grandson, emotionally manipulating him after the traumatic death of his parents. "He is mine now, as he should have always been," she wrote in an entry from 1958. "We are the last true Caldwells. We need to preserve our lineage at any cost." Further investigations revealed that the Caldwells' isolation was not just geographic, but also cultural and psychological. Margaret had been raised in an extremely closed community during the Great Depression, where marriages between cousins were common due to isolation and poverty. In his book Delta Secrets, Isolated Communities of Mississippi, local historian Dr. Robert Johnson documented how certain families in the swampy regions developed their own rules and moral codes. These communities existed in a cultural vacuum, perpetuating practices that dated back to previous generations, Johnson wrote. In the Caldwell case, we have evidence that Margaret herself was the daughter of first cousins, which may partially explain her distorted view of family relationships. The year 1963 marked the beginning of the judicial process against Margaret and Elijah Caldwell, one of the most complex and disturbing cases ever faced by the Mississippi judicial system. The charges included improper relationship, child neglect, and psychological abuse, terms that barely captured the true nature of the crimes. During the preliminary hearings, it became evident that Elijah was also a victim. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a man with the emotional development of a teenager, completely dependent on his grandmother. Elijah Caldwell shows clear signs of prolonged psychological manipulation, concluded Dr. Richard Matthews, the forensic psychiatrist appointed by the court. His capacity for true consent is questionable considering the control exercised by Margaret since his youth. An unprecedented ethical and legal dilemma was faced by the authorities. While public opinion clamored for severe punishment, experts argued that the case required a more nuanced approach, considering the complex tangle of mental illness, cultural isolation, and possible genetic factors. Held behind closed doors to protect the children's identities, saw Margaret, then 59, remain impassive throughout the process. She refused to show remorse or even acknowledge that there was something wrong with her relationship with her grandson. She genuinely believed she was protecting her family lineage, explained Dr. Elizabeth Parker, the psychologist who evaluated her. In her distorted mind, she was fulfilling a kind of sacred duty to preserve what she called the pure blood of the Caldwells. National notoriety was gained by the case when the Washington Post published an investigative report on the horror in the Mississippi swamps. The article, while careful not to reveal details that would identify the children, exposed the systemic failures that allowed the situation to persist for so long. How can a family isolate themselves so completely in the middle of the 20th century, the article questioned. Where were the neighbors, social services, local authorities before innocent children were born condemned to a life of suffering? Central in discussions about the case became the question of community responsibility. Many Belzoni residents later admitted that they had noticed strange behaviors from the family, but chose not to interfere. Here in Mississippi, we learn from an early age not to meddle in other people's business, an anonymous resident explained to the Post. Now, I wonder how many other families like the Caldwells still exist hidden in the swamps and mountains. Narrator's voice becomes more emotional. And you who are watching this video now, can you imagine the isolation and silent terror experienced by these children? If this case touched your heart, type in the comments, "No child deserves to live in darkness." Your comment helps keep the memory of these victims alive and raises awareness about the importance of community vigilance. A primary concern for the authorities became the fate of the 4 Caldwell children. Child development specialists were consulted to determine the best course of action. Separating the siblings could cause additional trauma, but keeping them together meant finding an adoptive home willing to accept for children with significant special needs. Dr. Catherine Stevens, a specialist in childhood trauma, worked intensively with the children during this transition period. Despite everything they suffered, they demonstrated a deep connection with each other, she reported. Sarah in particular assumed the role of protector for her younger brothers, demonstrating remarkable resilience. An important precedent for how the Mississippi judicial and social assistance system would handle similar cases in the future was established by the case. New policies were implemented to improve monitoring of isolated families and social worker training was expanded. Concluding in September 1963, the trial of Margaret and Elijah Caldwell reached a verdict that reflected the unprecedented complexity of the case. Margaret was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Elijah, on the other hand, was declared unable to respond criminally due to his mental condition and sent for treatment at a state psychiatric institution. This case represents a failure not just of 2 individuals, but of an entire society that allowed such horror to occur under our noses, declared Judge Harold Thompson in pronouncing the sentence. Let it serve as a warning about the dangers of extreme isolation and community indifference. But just beginning to unfold was the true legacy of the Caldwell case as experts tried to better understand the consequences of consanguinity. The medical team from the University of Mississippi, led by Dr. Walter Reynolds, meticulously documented the conditions of the Caldwell children. The children presented a spectrum of anomalies consistent with homozygosity of deleterious recessive genes, explained Dr. Reynolds in his study published in 1965. Beyond the evident physical deformities, all demonstrated cognitive impairment to different degrees, cardiovascular problems, and increased susceptibility to infections. Sarah, the second child, presented the least severe condition with an IQ measured around 65. The oldest, William, suffered from frequent seizures and progressive visual impairment. James struggled with chronic respiratory problems while the youngest, Thomas, faced the most serious consequences including severe cardiac malformation. Severe criticism for how the system had failed these children was faced by the state of Mississippi. In response, Governor Paul Johnson Jr. established a special task force to reform child protection services. The Caldwell case exposed systemic failures that we can no longer ignore, the governor declared. Every child in Mississippi deserves protection, no matter how remote their home. Inspiring a generation of social workers, doctors, and researchers, the story of the Caldwell family led to a deeper understanding about the consequences of consanguinity. When genetically very close individuals have children, the probability that harmful recessive genes will manifest increases dramatically, explained Dr. Mary Williams, a geneticist from Harvard University who studied the case. In the Caldwell case, we saw this magnified by generations of isolation. Revealing that the Caldwell's isolation did not begin with Margaret, family records recovered from the swampy property dated back to at least 3 previous generations. The Caldwells represent a case study on how geographical isolation can lead to genetic isolation, observed Dr. James Peterson, a cultural anthropologist. The swamp was a barrier to the genetic diversity necessary for a healthy population. Meanwhile, the challenge of integration into a society from which they had been completely isolated was faced by the 4 Caldwell children. After months in temporary homes, they were finally adopted by 2 different families. William and Sarah were adopted by a couple of teachers from Jackson, and James and Thomas by a family of doctors from Memphis. Specialized training to deal with the specific needs of the children was received by the adoptive families. These children need not only medical care, but a chance to experience a normal childhood with love and acceptance, stated Dr. Stevens, who continued to monitor their progress. It's remarkable how even after years of deprivation, they still maintain the capacity to form healthy bonds. Follow-up reports showed slow but steady progress. Sarah, in particular, flourished in her new environment, developing social skills and even surpassing some of the doctor's initial expectations. An unexpected twist to the Caldwell case was brought by the autumn of 1978 when Margaret, after 15 years of incarceration, died in the Mississippi State Penitentiary. The autopsy revealed something no one had suspected: Margaret suffered from a rare genetic condition called mosaic Turner syndrome. This discovery casts a new light on the entire case, commented Dr. Reynolds. The condition partially explains how Margaret managed to conceive at an advanced age. Rekindling academic interest in the case, the discovery led to a more compassionate perspective that recognized Margaret not only as a perpetrator, but also as a victim. Coinciding with Margaret's death was Sarah Caldwell's high school graduation, now Sarah Johnson after adoption. Contrary to all initial expectations, Sarah had become a dedicated student. She represents the power of human resilience, affirmed her adoptive mother, Elizabeth Johnson. She transformed a horror story into a testimony of overcoming. At 22, a courageous decision was made by Sarah to use her experience to help other children. She enrolled in the social work program at the University of Mississippi. "I don't remember much about my early years," Sarah admitted in a rare public testimony in 1985. "But I carry the scars. If my story can help prevent other children from going through the same, then all the suffering will have some purpose." Different paths were followed by Sarah's brothers. William, whose medical conditions were more severe, remained dependent on specialized care until his premature death at age 26. James achieved a semi-independent life with constant support. Thomas, the youngest, faced multiple heart surgeries but developed a remarkable talent for art. In 1987, almost 25 years after the discovery of the case, Elijah Caldwell died in the psychiatric institution. His doctors reported that he never fully understood the nature or consequences of his acts. The Caldwell case forces us to question the boundaries between victim and perpetrator, reflected Dr. Richard Matthews. Elijah was shaped by forces beyond his understanding. Remaining abandoned for years, the Caldwell property in the swamp became a kind of haunted site in local folklore. In 1992, county authorities finally demolished the deteriorated structure in a symbolic effort to close this dark chapter. However, in the legislative reforms it inspired, the legacy of the Caldwell case lives on. What happened in that Mississippi swamp in the 60s may seem like an account from another world. But similar cases, although perhaps less extreme, continue to exist, commented Dr. Elizabeth Parker during a lecture at Harvard University in 1998. Vigilance and education remain our best prevention tools. Dedicating her professional life to this cause, Sarah Caldwell Johnson established the New Beginnings Foundation in 1995. Every child deserves the chance to write their own story, free from the errors and traumas of previous generations, declared Sarah upon receiving the Mississippi State Humanitarian Award in 2001. "We are not defined by our past or our genetics, but by the choices we make." Something positive was eventually generated by the Caldwell case, with all its horror and tragedy. A deeper understanding of the effects of consanguinity, significant reforms in child protection systems, and through Sarah, a powerful voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. If you watched until here, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel." To access more exclusive cases like this, don't forget to subscribe. Take a moment to like this video and share it with someone. Each subscription, like and share helps us continue to reveal these obscure secrets of American history that deserve to be told.